Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you all to today's research seminar, which is the last in the research seminar series for 2020 in the School of Agriculture and Food Science. And today's seminar is on the topic of women in Irish agricultural history. The idea for this seminar emerged from the Equality and Diversity Committee in the School of Agriculture and Food Science. And this committee has been working on issues of gender equality and wider issues of equality and inclusion. The public image of Irish agriculture has traditionally been masculine, and it has often been said that the work and contribution of women in agriculture has been invisible. With today's seminar, we're hoping to reverse that, and we're taking a historical approach to making women's contribution more visible, and hopefully gaining a greater understanding of how the structures that we have today were developed from the actions and the decisions of our forebears. So I would like to very warmly welcome our guest speaker for today, Dr. Micheál O'Flaherty. Dr. O'Flaherty is a member of the Social Sciences Research Centre at the National University of Ireland in Galway, and he's a lecturer in history at the Dublin Business School. For the last 2 decades, he has researched and written about agricultural and rural history in modern Ireland, including 2 books, one on Irish agriculture nationalised, the Dairy Disposal Company and the Making of Modern Irish Dairy Industry, which was published by the Institute of Public Administration, and Developing Rural Ireland, a history of the Irish Agricultural Advisory Service, which will be published in 2021. He has also written and researched extensively on political history in modern Ireland, including a book on the treaty debating and establishing the Irish state, which he co-edited with Liam Weeks, and another one, The Birth of a State in the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which is also going to be coming out in 2021. He's been awarded the Meehan Prize for Best Conference Paper from the Political Studies Association of Ireland in 2017. He's a treasurer of the Agricultural History Society of Ireland, a member of the Committee of the European Rural History Film Association, and a co-founding member of the board of Studies in Arts and Humanities, which is an open access peer review academic journal. His research has been funded by the Irish Cooperative Organisation Society, the Royal Dublin Society, Teagasc and the Irish Research Council, and has been consistently commended for its cutting-edge contribution to Irish agricultural and rural historiography and to Irish political historiography. He completed his PhD in history at the Centre for Contemporary Irish History in Trinity College Dublin, and he has been interviewed on a variety of popular media outlets where he's been able to explain some of what has got us to where we are today. So with today's seminar, we're going to really see the value of historical analysis in helping us to understand how social structures are produced, reproduced and transformed. So if you have any questions or comments, you can write them using the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. And when Micheál has finished his presentation, we will have time for some discussion. So Micheál, I will hand over to you.
Thank you indeed, Monica, and good afternoon to everybody. So I am going to immediately upload my slides and get my presentation underway. Thank you. So I have to confess at the outset that entitling this presentation, I was very deliberately and mischievously disingenuous. I've titled it rather grandiosely, Women in Irish Agricultural History. The fact of the matter is, though, I'm not going to be dwelling on anything to do with history before the 20th century, or at least not to any great extent. So my image there on the right of your screens is particularly misleading. So what I'm going to be talking about is not all women in Irish agricultural history. I'm going to be talking about a very specific cohort of significant pioneering women in Irish agricultural history. And these were the instructors, or as we call them today, the advisors, the female instructors and the female advisors of the 20th century. I'm also As I indicate there, not going to be talking about history, the broad sweep of history, right from its roots in documented history in the pre-first millennial period. I'm going to be focusing exclusively on that century running between 1900 and the year 2000. And finally, as well, I'm cognizant of the fact that for most people in this group, even though you're obviously all practitioners in the area of agriculture and food, and I'm sure that you're very well versed in the story of Irish history in the 20th century, I'm nonetheless conscious of the fact that so much of what I will be discussing will be very new to you. So what I'm hoping to set forward over the course of the next 30 minutes or so is an overview of these pioneering female advisors in Irish agriculture in the 20th century. And hopefully that can be the basis on which we can have a more precise then question and answer session in the last part of the seminar. And indeed, it might be the platform from which we can go forward here and have future more specific seminars addressing specific aspects which I will of this history, which I will raise this afternoon. So it's very important that I begin in the most general of senses when I talk about the advisory service and advisors, that I talk about the modern origins of the advisory service. So needless to say, people have been instructing each other in terms of farming techniques and methodologies, you know, really since we became civilized. But modern advice in this area really began in the 18th century. That's really where we can trace its origins to, specifically anyway in Ireland. So as I'm sure you're all well aware, in the 18th century, the United Kingdom, of which we were then part, underwent its industrial revolution. And that involved many things, but what it involved principally was obviously a transition from an agricultural based economy to an industry-based economy configured around factories and manufacturing in a general sense, and indeed what we call today consumerism. And in order for the UK to be able to provide a workforce for its factories that were sprouting up, particularly in the north of England, the west of Scotland, indeed the northeast of Ireland, they had to be able to feed these people. So it was one thing for these people to transition from the farming way of life, which they and their ancestors would have engaged in the centuries preceding the Industrial Revolution, but they had to be able to guarantee that when this happened, that the people working in the factories could still be fed. So there had to be an agricultural revolution as much as there had to be an industrial revolution. And it's a great pity, I think, that historiography doesn't take account of the importance of the agricultural revolution that had to accompany this industrial revolution. And what needed to happen, as I'm sure you are all well aware, is that this much smaller number of people who continue to work in the agricultural sector, they had to now, despite having far less labor to call upon, they had to produce as much food as they had done historically, and indeed more food to feed the ever-growing population working in the factories in the new urban centres of Britain. So in order for them to do this, they had to get better at agriculture. And this is really where the modern agricultural scientists in this part of the world really came into their own. And these were the first instructors, the first advisors. And typically, these were people who were aristocrats, gentlemen, who had, I suppose, what you might say was an interest in agriculture and an interest in agricultural science. And they were the ones who chiefly came up with the techniques and the methodologies which would allow a lot less people working in farming to produce a lot more food by using the land resource more efficiently. Now, we in Ireland, of course, we didn't experience the Industrial Revolution, with the exception of the northeast of the island. We didn't experience the Industrial Revolution as they did in Britain, despite the fact, of course, that we were then part and parcel of the United Kingdom, or at least we would be from 1800. So we remained, by and large, an agricultural country. The fact of the matter was, though, that we continued to practice here that rudimentary form of agriculture, which they now were moving beyond in Britain, and had indeed, or were indeed moving beyond on the continent of Europe as well, as those countries industrialized. So we were late to the game of modernization. We did have the first instructors come into Ireland in the 18th century, but the fact of the matter was that by and large, agriculture continued in Ireland in the 18th century and on into the 19th century in a very similar fashion to how it had in previous centuries. And of course, this was a big contributory factor to the calamity that was the Great Famine, the story of which I'm sure is very fresh in people's minds after that excellent synoptic two-part series that was on RTE over the past number of weeks. Now, this image that I have here for you, this shows what agricultural instructors would have done right from the outset. So typically they would have established model farms, and on these model farms they would have demonstrated the cutting edge techniques that were required to grow more food or to raise more livestock on the same amount of land, but using far less labor. But this scene actually comes to us from England. This scene would have been very untypical in Ireland. So it wouldn't be until the 20th century that a professional instructor or advisory service really came into its own. So the story really begins in Ireland at the very, very, very end of the 1800s, and two very important figures stepped forward in this regard to bring us into a brave new world of modern agriculture. And these two men are pictured on my screen here. I've deliberately put my text over their eyes because I want this to be a discussion of women in agriculture. So I don't want to get off on the wrong foot by dwelling too much on these two individuals. Having said that, it would be inappropriate of me not to set the scene by explaining who they were and what they did. The man on the left of your screen is Horace Curzon Plunkett. You might not see, this might be a new photograph for a lot of you because he's typically pictured as an older gentleman. Now, Horace Plunkett was a member of the Anglo-Irish gentry, but he was somebody who had a particular interest in the development of agricultural systems in Ireland. He was more cognizant than most of just how unsatisfactory the structure of agriculture was in Ireland, and how imperative it was for Ireland, if it was to achieve prosperity in the 20th century, how imperative it was that interventions happened to change this. So he led virtually a one-man campaign to encourage the British government to properly resource the development of agriculture in Ireland in the 20th century. And it was a successful campaign. And it bore fruit in the form of the creation of the Department of Agriculture and Technical Instruction in Ireland at the turn of the 20th century. Now, this in and of itself was momentous because this was a full 20 years before Ireland achieved independence. Plunkett was able to persuade the British government that Ireland should have its own indigenous Department of Agriculture directing agricultural development in Ireland itself. Now, he was the man with the vision, but it was the man on the right of your screen, Thomas Patrick Gill, a former nationalist MP, who was the man now who would really develop the organization of the new department. Now, this story, the story of Plunkett and Gill's intervention and the story of the foundation of the Department of Agriculture and how important it was, that story is quite well known. Indeed, it would be very remiss of me not to mention that the historian of the department is of your parish in UCD, Professor Emeritus Mary E. Dail. She has written the comprehensive history of the department, and if any of you haven't read it, I would certainly encourage you to do so. But the fact is that aside from the department, Plunkett and Gill were also responsible too for establishing the first professional agricultural advisory service in Ireland. It would be operated jointly by the new department and by the new county councils, which were being established at the same time, just at the turn of the 20th century. And this now would revolutionize agricultural education in Ireland, and it would be the key and most important thing in transforming Irish agriculture from being, relatively backward, relatively rudimentary, to where we are today at the cutting edge of agriculture on the European stage. So the plan was that an advisory service would be established not on a national level, but on a nationwide level. And what I mean by that distinction is that each county would have its own advisory service, which would be charged with developing agriculture within that county unit. So there would be, my map is slightly incorrect there. I chose it because it's eye-catching, but as I'm sure you all know, there were actually at the beginning of the 20th century and up until quite recently, 2 Tipperary. So there were actually 33 counties in Ireland at the turn of the 20th century. And each of these 33 counties would have their own advisory service. As I said, jointly administered by the new county councils, which had just been inaugurated at the end of the 1800s, and by the new Department of Agriculture, headquartered in Dublin. Now, these advisory services would comprise 3 branches. In other words, there will be 3 different types of instructor or advisor working for each of these 33 county advisory services. So the main man, and I use the gender definition there specifically, would be the general agriculture instructor, and he would always be a man. And he would be the individual who was charged with being omnicompetent. He would be expected to give help and assistance to farmers in his county on every aspect of farming technique and agricultural methodology. These agricultural instructors, they would be educated initially in the Royal College of Science, which of course is where government buildings is housed today, and subsequently then of course from the 1920s they would be educated at UCD in the new Faculty of Agricultural Science. They would be joined then by the horticultural and beekeeping instructors. So it was deemed appropriate that there should be a specific cohort of instructors who should help, especially small to medium-sized farmers, to develop their horticultural and indeed, if it was pertinent, beekeeping enterprises. And they would be trained largely at the Albert College, which of course is part of the DCU campus today. And they would also be exclusively male. And then the third of the 3 branches, and this is the branch that we're going to, needless to say, focus on this afternoon, were the poultry keeping and butter making instructresses. And they were all women. And what they were charged with doing was helping, teaching, assisting farming women, which is to say in old money, farmers' wives, farmers' daughters, helping them to better and more efficiently raise poultry and help them in dairying areas better and more efficiently to produce high quality butter. And the rationale for this was that particularly small to medium-sized farmers, as we all know, I'm sure, in this audience, inches made a difference, a big difference when you were a small and medium-sized farm or medium-sized farmer in early 20th century Ireland. And if farming women on Irish farmsteads could eke out a little more income from producing hens, moreover from producing eggs and from producing butter, then this could make a very big difference to the overall financial prospects on the farm. Now, the reason that, of course, women were given this very specific role and men were given the other 2 very specific roles is that this reflected very much the conservatism of the age. Obviously, we're in the Victorian era here. There's been a kind of a kickback to the modernity of the Enlightenment in previous centuries. And women and men are seen as having very rigid, defined roles in society in general. So it's no surprise to see that this will be brought to bear when the advisory service was established in Ireland at the beginning of the 20th century. So quite simply, it was assumed that men were intrinsically best placed to give general agricultural advice. They were also intrinsically best placed to give advice vis-a-vis horticulture. And it was also assumed that women were intrinsically best placed to give advice when it came to poultry keeping and butter making. And you can probably guess as to some of the logic that underpinned all of that. So quite frankly, there was an assumption that the female temper was better suited to understanding the temper of the hen, better suited to understanding the temper of the cow. You know, this is the kind of the crude logic that underpins so much of this Victorian gender-based thinking. But it's very important to say that the women were not also rans in terms of the three branches in the new advisory service. This role of poultry keeping and butter making instructress, I would actually argue, was primus inter pares. As I'm sure you're all well aware, the dairy industry in Ireland had been hugely important, hugely significant. It was significant on a global scale. This wonderful image on the left of your screen, this is taken from an 18th century atlas of the world. And as you can see, it's portraying Cork as a major dairying centre, a major butter centre. And the fact of the matter was, butter in the 18th century was a hugely important commodity on the world stage in a way that, you know, it wouldn't be impertinent for me to say that oil and gas was or has been in our 20th and 21st century world. And so the Cork butter market and the prices that butter received on the Cork butter market in the 1800s and the 1900s, this commanded world attention. Now the butter industry and the wider dairy industry in Ireland was going through a bit of a dip at the beginning of the 20th century, more of that in a moment, but it was still seen as the crown and the jewel of Irish agriculture. And central to the historic success of the butter industry had been women, as this image here accurately depicts. You can see here that it's the woman milking the cow. Moreover, it's the woman who is, as we would say today, adding value to the liquid milk by churning it into butter. So according to women, this role as poultry keeping and butter making instructress, yes, of course, it was delimiting their area of responsibility, but it's important to say that in many ways, this was the biggest single area of responsibility in early 20th century Ireland. The dairy industry remained very important in Irish agriculture. There was a perception in general that it could be revived and Ireland could once again be a preeminent dairy producer on the world stage. I want to say just briefly as well, if you like my images, and I hope that you do, I have to give thanks to Peter Foynes, the curator of the wonderful Cork Butter Museum, who provided me with most of the illustrations that I'm using today. Now, the women who would go forward to be poultry keeping and butter making instructresses, they will be educated at the Munster Institute in Cork. This is a contemporary or near contemporary image of the wonderful and beautiful Munster Institute building, which today is part of the UCC campus. Now, this had been a dairy school established at the end of the 1800s. So the new Department of Agriculture now would take it over for the specific purpose of providing an education centre for churning out poultry keeping and butter making instructresses. And it would immediately be a very impressive and progressive institution in delivering this kind of vocational education. In Britain, you had the Poultry College, which was part of Reading University, which was located at Dail in Berkshire. And a lot of the very early Irish poultry keeping and butter making instructresses, they would have been educated there. But its education curriculum really paled into insignificance when the Munster Institute got up and running in the early 20th century. The Munster Institute offered a much more bespoke course that really equipped these women for the role that they were going to fulfill as interlocutors between the science and farming women. The college course at Dail in Berkshire, it was far more theoretical. So the Munster Institute itself was a pioneer. I'll be talking about the women who graduated from it as pioneers, but the institute itself was a pioneering institution. Now, the poultry keeping and butter making instructresses, and I'm going to refer to them now to save myself as PIs, which is how they were colloquially known in history. They really hit the ground running. The Munster Institute turned out graduates in very large numbers from the early 1900s. So every one of the 33 county committees of agriculture throughout the Irish nation. They were equipped with their PIs very, very rapidly. This contrasts with the situation regarding the men. There were quite a number of horticultural instructors turned out at the beginning of the 20th century, but still not a sufficient number to meet the requirements of all 33 county committees. And even more so, there was a deficit of general agriculture instructors. The Royal College of Science course would only really get up and running in the first decade of the 1900s. So for most of that first decade of the 20th century, most Irish counties didn't have general agricultural instructors. I should say as well here at this point, if you're particularly interested in the education process of instructors and advisors, I would direct you to another member of your parish, Dermot Ruan, who's currently working on a history of agricultural education. So he's very much the expert in this area. Now, the image I have on your screen here is of a group of women who had gathered for a poultry keeping class somewhere in the north of Ireland. This would have been a little bit later, around the 1920s. In actual fact, I'll direct you to the man standing on the roof there. He's a member of the Beef Specials. So that will give you an indication of the chronology for this photograph. Now, the early interaction between this first generation of PIs and Irish farming women took several forms. I mean, there were PIs who visited individual farming households and gave individual tuition to farming women. They did indeed host demonstrations as well on model farms. But by and large, the men, it was more so the men who enjoyed that kind of interaction on the farm and with farmers. Strictly speaking, the PIs tended more so to educate Irish farming women using the classroom. So they would organize classes, short-term classes, typically in the winter in Irish rural settings. And rural settings were typically chosen, very rural settings, as opposed to county towns, because the advisory service was very keen to reach as many members of the population as possible, so that, you know, it wasn't just the a certain constituency of well-to-do farming women who could afford to come into the local town who benefited from the education. It was also the poorer women who couldn't afford to travel you know, beyond their local areas. It was very important to the advisory service that these people received the benefits of what the PIs were doing as well. So most of the interactions were class-based. Now, the PIs had to, and these were, you know, as you can imagine, very young women, and some of them under the age of 20, all of course unmarried, because in those days and up until relatively recently, there was a marriage bar in place, so they couldn't be married women. They had to traipse the country and organize schoolhouses or village halls to enable them to host these classes, host these meetings. And they didn't. I mean, Irish infrastructure was obviously very underdeveloped, and they didn't have access to automobiles, so they had to use the public transport such as it was. So it was a very tough job. It was a very arduous job. And then they had to canvass as well, because a lot of women, farming women, particularly, you know, farming women in the poorer locales and from the poorer backgrounds, they were skeptical about education. So they had to be canvassed and won over. And something that I've noticed in my research is that what a lot of the instructoresses used to do is that they would make contact with prominent people in each locality. And once they got these prominent farming women, you know, typically the women who were married to the big farmers in any given district, once they got them to commit to taking a class, for instance, in butter making or poultry keeping, then this would encourage the women from the humbler backgrounds to come forward and partake in the classes as well. I've noticed, for instance, when I looked at Galway in this period as a county case study, that in East Galway, one of the farming women that the PI there made a big effort to reach out to was Bridget Hogan, who was mother of a future Minister for Agriculture and the wife of a very large farmer in East Galway. Equally in Connemara, Jane Conroy was reached out to by the instructor directly to ask her to come to her class and to canvass and propagandize on behalf of what the PIs were doing throughout South Connemara. Jane Conroy was married to a local politician called P.D. Conroy. So there was a very, you know, there was a very refined approach that PIs took to evangelizing and spreading the educational message. And not surprisingly too, they won instant esteem. So we think about the esteem that the schoolmistress would have had in rural Ireland, you know, from the 19th century. Well, from the beginning of the 20th century, the PIs would have had a similar esteem throughout rural Ireland as well. Now, their focuses were manifold, but probably their biggest focus, and particularly when they were looking at butter making, was to try to encourage farming women to produce better quality products. And that had a twofold rationale behind it. I mean, first of all, it was very important if the women, you know, were to stand a chance of getting more money for what they were producing on their farms in the form of eggs and butter, then obviously it behooved them to be producing high quality products. But also this was an age as well, at the beginning of the 20th century, when consumers now, you know, they were becoming very conscious of food quality. The Danes were the first to recognize this. And in 1901, they introduced the famous Lure mark. And if Danish butter was ascribed the Lure mark, this meant that it met, you know, very stringent standards. Ireland was playing catch up in this regard. And, you know, we wouldn't have this level of standardization until after independence in the 20s. But nonetheless, the PIs were engaged in trying to, you know, rescue the reputation of Irish butter and burnish it in the face of Danish competition, because the fact was that the Danes, even though they were at a greater remove from the British market, they were our chief competitors when we were selling butter for export into the British market. Now, what they also had to do as well is they had to report on everything. And I'm very glad as a historian that this was the case. Every year, they had to make a contribution in terms of an overview of their work, what they'd done in the previous year, to the annual reports of their county committees of agriculture. So if you go, and I would strongly advise you to do so if you have a mind, if you go to the Department of Agriculture's wonderful library on Kildare Street, the librarian there, the chief librarian, Paolo, would be only too delighted to welcome you. And they have an almost complete collection of annual reports from the counties of committees of agriculture dating from the early 20th century. And when you peruse these, you will find that within them, there were reports from the agricultural instructors, but there were also reports from the PIs as well. So they had to be very literate people. They had to be able to, you know, express in a cogent form exactly what it was they were doing in the county each year, and had to be able to account for themselves. They had to be able to demonstrate what they had achieved, you know, what had gone against them. So, you know, they were under tremendous pressure in terms of both how they logistically organized their daily work, but also because of the accountability, you know, that they were expected to measure up to. Now, the PIs of the three branches of the advisory service, they were the ones who most immediately achieved results. Part of this was because, of course, as I said, it would be at least 10 years before most counties had horticultural and general agricultural instructors. So the women did have an edge, but nonetheless, I don't think that takes away from their precocious achievements in the early 20th century. In terms of data to back this up, it's quite difficult for me to find data that corroborates what I'm claiming, that the education that farming women received from these PIs had an instant financial dividend for small to medium-sized farmers, because at the beginning of the 20th century, we obviously didn't have the National Farm Survey, so we just haven't got that level of data. But there are some very interesting snippets that give, you know, strong indication that backs up what I'm saying. So there's a district, for instance, in South Connemara called Leitrim Callow. It's in the wider area of Canton and Nillon, if people are familiar with that. It's where Leitrim Moor and Leitrim Malon are. The image on the left of your screen is of a football match in the very early 1900s that took place in Leitrim Moor near Leitrim Callow. Now, this was a very, very poor part of the country. And I came across data relating to incomes in this part of the world and relating to the first decades of the 20th century. And it was hugely telling. So in each given household, there were two conspicuous sources of income. One, and the biggest by far, was from remittances from the United States. So family members in the US, in places like Boston and Philadelphia and New York, sending money home. That accounted for the lion's share of the income on these very small farms in Southwest Connemara. But what also contributed in a very big way was the money that was being earned from selling eggs in the Galway egg market. And so these PIs, in helping these farming women to produce more and better quality eggs, they were having a dramatic impact, not just on these women and their ability to earn money, but moreover, their farm households. They, along with these remittances from the United States, were really, keeping so many small and medium-sized farms from going to ruin in the early 20th century. Also, when Ireland became independent in the 1920s and we got our first Minister for Agriculture, the man pictured on the right of your screen, Patrick Hogan, we got somebody who was probably our best ever Minister for Agriculture. He was a real technocrat. Not only was he from an agricultural background, but he was very well versed in agricultural science, and he understood what needed to be done to turn the corner and make Ireland a prosperous agricultural country. And one of the things that he recognized chiefly was that we needed to make our products, our agricultural exports, the best in the world. We needed to once again compete, for instance, with the Danes. So he initiated a huge quality drive from the 1920s. But what really buttressed that from the outset was the promotion of quality that the PIs had already been undertaking right from the beginning of the 20th century. Now, there would, at the middle point of the 20th century, be a period of transition for women in the advisory service. So there would be both rupture and continuity. So in terms of rupture, PIs now in the middle of the 20th century, they were coming to the end in terms of a vocation. The fact was that Ireland was becoming increasingly concerned with commercial farming, and farming was, as I'm sure you all know, moving away from the mixed farming model on small to medium-sized farms and moving towards specification. And that meant that poultry keeping was reduced dramatically. So really poultry keeping only became viable where it was done on an intense level in places like County Monaghan. And in other parts of the country, it just disappeared and was displaced with, for instance, dairy farming or dry stock cattle farming entirely. And this meant that, women in the farming family, they were squeezed out. If poultry keeping continued to be practiced, it was now practiced on a grand scale, but practiced by men. Equally, the creameries now were taking over, and home-produced butter was no longer deemed acceptable. Patrick Hogan, for instance, led a drive to eradicate homemade butter. So by the middle part of the 20th century, it was only creamery butter that was being produced. And of course, as we all know, the creameries were run by creamery managers who were males. They were male graduates of the Faculty of Dairy Science in UCC. But there was also happily continuity. The women continued to work as dairymaids in the factories, in the creameries, and in the cheese factories more specifically. And although the creamery manager was the face of the creamery, it was the women behind the scenes who often did so much of the technical work. And this image here on your screen, this is of women leaving a shift in the cheese factory in Mitchelstown in the middle part of the 20th century. Now, in terms of the advisory service, the women in the advisory service now, in the post-war period, they began to be retrained as farm home management advisors. And this would be a wonderfully exciting development. The farm home management advisors who now began to supersede the PIs, they were trained also in the Munster Institute. They were trained to help farming women to manage their households. So as I said, Ireland was transitioning from subsistence farming to commercial farming. I mean, it had already made that transition when it came to big farms, but even the small to medium-sized farms now, from the post-war period onwards, were transitioning from subsistence farming to commercial farming. And it was recognized by the department that women would be crucial to this transitionary period. It was recognized that if farms were to be run on a commercial basis, all right, then the chances were that it was the farming women, the farmers' wives, even the farmers' daughters, who were going to be the ones who were going to be able to facilitate this. These are the ones who the women had traditionally, as I'm sure you all know, looked after the purse strings in the household. These are the people, who were best placed to facilitate this transition, to bring, homesteads into the 20th century. So the farm home management advisors, they were trained now in the Munster Institute to help women to, to fulfill roles in a farming sense on the farm, but they were moreover trained to help women to financially manage commercially viable farms. And this first generation of farm home management advisors who graduated in the early 1960s, they were exposed to the best of teaching in this area from Austria and Bavaria. That was the part of Europe where it was recognized more than most that farming women were central to the transition from subsistence to commercial farming. So the first Irish farm home management advisors, yes, they were trained at the Munster Institute, but they were initially trained in places like Bavaria and Austria. Also, there were big links between the United States and its agricultural extension service and Ireland at this point. And they also recognized how central the farming women were to the farming household. So a lot of women also were sent up to the Kellogg Agricultural Extension School in UCD to be educated in this area also. And thankfully, so many of these women have left us testimony. So Peter Foynes, who I mentioned a moment ago at the Cork Butter Museum, he's interviewed several of these women. Maura Fenley from County Laois was one of these women, and she's left us a memoir, and that's the cover of her book there on the left of your screen. And I think the cover, it's a little bit crude in terms of its production value, but it's wonderful that it shows that you've got an image of, a very old-fashioned looking traditional Irish farming cottage at the top of the image, and at the bottom of the image, you've got a wonderful image of a modern farmhouse. And in between, you've got that picture of the Munster Institute, showing you how central the Munster Institute and these farm home management advisory graduates from the Munster Institute were from bringing rural Ireland from, from the relatively underdeveloped position it was in to the cusp of modern development that we were in the latter part of the 20th century. So this is my final slide now, and I just want to draw out that point a little bit more. The farm home management advisors, they did tremendous work between 1962 and the 1980s, but by that stage it was deemed that they had also, like the PIs before them, become obsolete. So the fact was that we had made this transition, for better or worse, to commercial farming. And also the fact was that in a certain way, the influence of farming women within the farming household had diminished, with obviously the women's liberation movement in the 1970s, but moreover, with the new dynamism in the Irish economy, there were job opportunities outside of the house for farming women for the first time. So in many ways, the best way they sought to make their farm households viable was for them to go out and get employment outside of farming in their areas. And that's what they increasingly did from the period of the 1970s on into the 1980s. So it was deemed by the powers that be that the role of the farm home management advisor had once again become obsolete. Sadly, the last female iteration of advisor in the Irish Advisory Service was the socio-economic advisor. And unlike the previous two iterations, this was a much less successful role. These women were retrained to try to deal with that sticky and thorny issue of farm inheritance. It was deemed that they would be very well placed to advise farming households on how best to hand on farms to offspring. But of course, that was, as we all know in this audience, that was a knotty issue beyond the ability of any single category of advisor to be able to marshal and handle successfully. Happily though, by this stage, female advisors were being accepted into the senior management ranks of the advisory service. So really speaking, the gender differentiation now was breaking down and it was breaking down for the better. I haven't come across any overt prejudice against female advisors in the advisory service, but the advisory service, like so much else, was inhibited by the all-pervasive conservatism of Ireland for most of the 20th century, so that senior management roles were typically reserved implicitly for men. But that really began to change in the 1970s as the European influence took hold, but also as people like the woman I pictured on the right of your screen, Mary Walsh, who was a farm home management advisor from County Laois, who came forward to challenge the system as well. And Mary Walsh was somebody who travelled up to UCD to undertake a master's degree in agricultural extension, and she put herself forward for senior management positions. And she was the first female Deputy CAO, Deputy Chief Agricultural Officer, to be appointed in Monaghan in the 1970s. And she was also the first female CAO, the first female Chief Agricultural Officer, to be appointed in County Meath in 1985. So I think, you know, that's a kind of a happy note and a détente in which I can draw my presentation to a conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Micheál. We'll definitely have to get you back. There's so many threads there that I'd really like to learn so much more about. We've some questions in. Some of them you've answered already, but there's one from Dermot Ruan here, who you mentioned about why the Daithí chose the Munster Institute for Women and the Albert College for men's education, and what influences were there on their decisions, conscious or unconsciously, about limiting the level of education available to women, and what role or influence did the church have? And I suppose I would add, you know, I'd be very interested to hear that as well, particularly, you know, in terms of that rural conservatism, the influence that the church had.
Yes, and so I think there's probably two questions there, Monica, aren't there? So I'll respond to the question about the Munster Institute and the Albert first. So I think the choice of the Munster Institute, it struck me, was quite pragmatic. So it had been established as a school for dairymaids at the end of the 19th century. So I suppose it was just maybe the most obvious piece of infrastructure available. Also, as you know, dairy farming has its heartland in the southern province of Munster. So even though it's at the wrong end of the country in terms of, you know, providing opportunity for everybody, it was probably well chosen when we bear that in mind. Also, from 1907, it was complemented by the Ulster Dairy School, which was opened in Cookstown in County Tyrone. Now that's interesting as well, what you mentioned. I mean, they were given what we would call in today's currency a level 6 qualification. They weren't given a full degree. The men, it is important to say though, weren't either. So as Dermot, and he's very much, as I said, the expert in this area, as he would point out, the men who were coming through the Albert, they were not accorded, by and large anyway, a full degree either, or weren't encouraged onto a degree program. But equally, the men who came through the Royal College of Science, they strictly speaking weren't getting a full degree either. They were getting an associateship. It wasn't until the Faculty of Agricultural Science opened in UCD that things were properly standardized, and that, you know, they were then graduates with bachelors in agricultural science. But to go back to I suppose the central point about maybe some gender bias in that respect, I think it's yet another reflection of the, for want of a better word, contemporary values, Monica, that it simply wasn't seen as necessary for these women in the roles that they were in. As important as they were, it wasn't seen as necessary for them to have degrees. It was probably deemed as well that they weren't up to doing degrees, and just bear with me on this one. The fact was that a lot of them would have been graduates of rural domestic economy schools, and although the education in these schools was, you know, appropriate and vocational, it wasn't classical education. And you know yourself, in those days, if you were accessing third level, you had to know your Latin and your Greek as well as everything else. So I'd say it was the cultural conservatism that was behind that differentiation. And then to respond to the question about the church, yeah, the church's influence is massive. So the county committees of agriculture, they were set up by each county council to oversee the activities of the advisory services in each county. So in many ways, and I feel so sorry for them, The advisors were accountable to two masters. They were accountable to the department, and they were accountable to these county committees of agriculture. And the lion's share, if you look at the membership of these early county committees of agriculture, the lion's share of them were clerics. Okay, by and large, they were clerics. Now, I would also say, though, that they were clerics who knew their place, and that's not often you can say that about Irish clerics at the turn of the 20th century. But it strikes me, and I found no evidence to the contrary, it strikes me that they left the advisors, both the male and the female advisors, they left them alone to do their work. But at the same time, of course, they would have upheld the hegemony as well. And even the very small things that you can't but notice. For instance, you know, you look at the roll call of male advisors, they're all just given their names. You look at the roll call of female advisors, they're all referred to as Miss so-and-so, Miss so-and-so other. When it comes to the reportage within the annual reports, the general instructor gives his report first. The horticultural instructor gives his report next. The PIs are left very much to the end as well. So I would say there was definitely bias, but it was consistent with the time, and it was certainly no more prejudicial than you would have found in other areas.
Here was a cohort of young rural women getting some education, going and working around the countryside, having their own incomes while they were doing that. So their minds are being opened to a lot of things. You're also in that period, you know, coming up to the War of Independence. To what extent did, you know, is there any evidence of the feminist movement influencing those women?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I'm sorry to say, Monica, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I haven't come across any explicit evidence of what you're outlining there, even though the rationale of what you're putting forward is so compelling in and of itself. But unfortunately, I haven't found the evidence to corroborate it. So if we take the revolution, that's an excellent cipher for judging these women in that respect. And I mean, there were certainly plenty of these female advisors who were members of Cumann na mBan, but they weren't prominent members of Cumann na mBan. When you juxtapose them with the men, there were a number of men who were prominent members of the IRA. Having said that, though, and I think this is what trumps everything again, and this might, you know, this might warm your cockles a little bit. There's not a huge number of men who are prominent within the revolutionary movement either. There's a couple of men who were doing daring do things, but they're the exception rather than the rule. So what it strikes me is that these people had a very professional role, and they had this esteem within their communities. And I think that kept them focused on their jobs, and they just didn't seek to, if you like, exceed their remit in that respect. I'd say the fact that they, you know, they were enjoying decent remuneration, and their pay, the women's pay, was quite commensurate with the men's pay. I'd say they would have been very concerned about rocking the boat and jeopardizing their position as well. That would be my speculation.
Well, there's a couple of more questions here, and a lot of them are around the practical life of the poetry instructors. One was about how they got around. You answered the one about how they promoted or how they did their evangelization. How were they paid? How long did they stay in the role? And did they have a short lifespan in their career because of the marriage ban, generally?
Yes, that certainly is the case. So their careers were, I suppose, prolonged by dint of the fact that they typically were very young when they qualified. So I would say on average, and this is based on my kind of cursory observations, when I've been looking at individual counties, it would strike me that they would typically have a career of somewhere between 10 and 15 years. That would be typically the case. And then in terms of the other question that you asked, yeah, so and I feel for the men in a similar regard, but I think the women got a particularly raw deal. What they had to do was they had to cycle around. They had to set themselves up. So as it was originally organized, they would be given specific districts, but these districts wouldn't be fixed districts. They'd be given them for, you know, single seasons at a time. So they'd have to arrange boarding houses for themselves. And then they'd have to bicycle around these areas then, you know, going to their classes, but moreover, just organizing their classes, talking to the local schoolmaster, talking to the local priest, and trying to get the infrastructure in place before they could even begin to think about running the classes, and then to promote them within the areas as well. So they were allowed a certain mileage, a certain allowance, but what is very telling is that there were complaints from some of the women that they were not getting the same mileage as the men were. Okay, so I definitely came across evidence of prejudice in that regard. Also, I came across implicit evidence of prejudice in the form of automobiles. So when cars first began to be used, and they were used relatively early on, it was the men who were getting the use of the cars more so than the women. And in a lot of instances, the women would have had more right to have access to the cars as well, because their geographical reach would be typically larger than the reach of the men.
Okay, we're going to have to bring things to a close, but I think that's that it will remind us that I suppose the fight for any kind of equality isn't won easily and is ongoing. And there's some nice comments, there's questions about the level of education PIs had to have before entering the Munster Institute, were they from more well-to-do backgrounds, and also about the fact that the Irish PIs were getting knowledge from Austria and Germany that they were transferring to Irish farm women was quite enlightened, although possibly it was Kinder, Kirche and Kuka in its philosophy.
You're 100% right there. I mean, you've only got to look at the two countries. They were getting the collegiality from Austria and Bavaria, probably the two most Catholic districts.
And probably not a hotbed of feminism at the time. So Micheál, I think we better bring it to a close. It's 2 o'clock. Thank you so much on our behalf, and I think we will really look forward to welcoming you back again and to reading your book, I think, on the history of the advisory service, which will be out next year. And I think for a lot of our students, it's important knowing the giants on whose shoulders they stand. So thank you very, very much.